about the concepts in building an ethical organization, the challenges that you'll face, the reason that you'll face the challenges, and some of the things that you can do to overcome those challenges. And of course, at the bottom of everything is the reasons to do it. And that is that you'll have a more successful organization, and ultimately at the end of the day you'll end up making more money, which is of course the goal of every business. So now I want to talk about some of the partners that I mentioned earlier in my talks to you. I've mentioned to you that you have to widen the circle that you consider to be the business, and not simply see it as a profit center, and therefore only relate to the shareholders as the core audience that you are running the business for. I mentioned to you, excuse me, that the customers, the employees, and certainly the environment all need to be considered as partners in the business, so that when we're creating policies and making decisions, when all of those components are considered, ultimately the decisions are better and more profitable for the whole organization. So I want to talk about, for the next little while, about the customer. Now, everybody would clearly admit that the customer is certainly an important part of any business plan, because if you don't have a customer, you pretty well don't have a business, despite everything else being perfect. And by that I mean you have a product that rates 10 out of 10, staff that are rated 10 out of 10, enough investment to make everything happen. But if nobody wants what you got, not much point to all the other things. So certainly the customer is important. And every time I've spoken with people or been called out on a consulting contract and asked, and I've asked the head of the organization anything about his customers, there's also always a lot of praise and compliments and a recognition that the customer is critical and important. But the reality is that those are all empty words. Most people could care less about the customer. What they do care about is the fact that the customer buys their stuff. So if you're buying their stuff, they love you. And if you're not buying their stuff, they really could care less about you. That means you don't really care about the customer. So in order to explain that concept to you, I think what we've got to focus in on is the singular reason that any customer buys any product. Now, when I say buys any product, I mean a customer who comes to buy a jug of milk, which is available in 20 other stores in your neighborhood, or a customer who comes to buy a hand-painted work of art by one of the most famous artists in the world today. Or let's say someone who comes along to buy a Picasso or a Rembrandt. One product is one of a kind. It's the only one there is. And the other one, milk, is available in dozens of brands and almost in every food or convenience store. There is one thing that unites both of these customers, and it is the critical component that allows you to understand the customer and also how to direct your efforts towards the customer. And that singular idea is that no customer buys anything unless it gives them pleasure. So a person is not going to spend millions of dollars on a Rembrandt or a Picasso unless it gives them pleasure. Not necessarily a pleasure that you can experience, but for them, there's a pleasure. Similarly, even when they spend $1.50 on a liter of milk or $3 on a liter of milk, they buy that milk in a place and sometimes a brand that gives them pleasure. It is a fundamental principle that underlies all of the marketing and merchandising and advertising efforts that we make. Now, the pleasure principle is not as simplistic as you might think, because it involves an entire host of psychological components that that interact in the mind of the customer. And I'm going to try to share with you probably the most important one, and then I'll leave the rest for you to discover. So usually what I like to do is kind of tell this story about how to make anyone fall in love with you in 5 minutes or less. So it's a fairy tale story, so you'll will allow me to kind of story tell it for you. Once upon a time, there was a young woman. She had 2 boyfriends, Bill and Charlie. Now both of these guys were amazing, and they were in love with her, and they were fantastic guys. And every Friday night she would go out with Bill, and every Saturday night she'd go out with Charlie. Now the problem that she had is she couldn't decide which one of these 2 guys she wanted to date more seriously, because both of them were exceptional. Now, she knew she had to make a choice, but since there was no pressure, why rush it? Of course, comes one Friday night, and everything changed. She goes out with Bill, takes her to a nice movie, they go out for dessert later, and when the cake comes to the table, he deftly inserts a beautiful little black box. When she turns it around, she's astonished. He opens it up, a beautiful engagement ring, and he asks her to marry him. Now she loves Bill. He's a great guy. She doesn't know what to do. She says, I'm totally caught off guard. Please, I apologize. Let me give you my answer on Sunday. I don't know what to do right now. And of course, Bill says, yeah, sure, absolutely. Think about it. No problem. She goes home. She knows she's in trouble. And she's thinking about it all day Saturday. And she happens to have a date with Charlie on Saturday night. So she can't figure out what to do. And of course, she goes out with Charlie. Charlie takes her as well. Beautiful dinner. They go out to play. After the play, they stop off for coffee. When her head is turned, he puts this beautiful little box on the table. And of course, she turns around. He opens the box, gets down on one knee, and asks her to marry him. And she just breaks down. She starts crying and sobbing. She has no idea what to do. And in between these deep breaths, she asks Charlie if he wouldn't mind waiting until Sunday when she's a little bit more composed, and then she'll give him her answer. And he says, absolutely no problem. And it brings her home, and she's sitting in her apartment, and she knows that she's got to make a decision. But she doesn't know what to do. She starts crying and weeping because it's not easy. She doesn't know which one of these 2 guys to choose. And she believes that the choice is a lifetime choice. So what if she makes the wrong choice? At that very moment when she's thinking about that, there's a little pop in the room, And of course, because this is a fairy tale, who's standing in the room but her fairy godmother? Her fairy godmother looks at her and says, what's the problem? Why are you crying? And of course she explains the entire story about Bill and about Charlie and how she loves them both and she doesn't know who to choose and she's afraid of making a bad choice and she's breathing heavily and she's sobbing. And her fairy godmother says, you know what? Just relax. Take it easy. You don't have to worry. I'm going to tell you what you need to do in order for you to figure out whether you should choose Bill or Charlie. Really? I would so need that. The fairy godmother said, this is easy. All you've got to do is take a piece of paper for each one of them. One for Bill, one for Charlie. I want you to write on each piece of paper all the great things about each one of these guys. When you've written the last thing for the second person, immediately at that point, the name of the one that you need to marry is going to pop into your head. And that's the one to choose. Sounds great. So she takes the first piece of paper, writes down all good things about Bill. He's educated, he's kind, he's loving, he's got a great job, and it's a wonderful career. He has a wonderful family, and he makes a good living, and he's handsome. All the things that you think might be important are on that list. And she takes the next piece of paper, getting a little nervous. She starts writing down all the good things about Charlie, and they're all virtually the same. Good family, good education, makes a good living, great job, great potential. All the good things that you can imagine that you would say about a person, she wrote them down about Charlie. Now she's coming down to the bottom of the list, and she's finished writing the last thing about Charlie. Closes her eyes, and like a neon sign, the name of the person she needs to marry pops into her head. It's amazing. It's exactly what her grandmother said would happen. Her fairy godmother said, and that's exactly what happened. And now she knew what to do. And of course, at that very moment, her fairy godmother popped into the room and asked her how everything was going. She said, amazing. I wouldn't have believed that your idea would work, but his name just popped right into my head. Fairy godmother says, okay, which one of the two guys did you choose? She says, I chose Charlie. Really? Let me see the lists. So she takes a look at Bill. She says, whoa, Bill's pretty good. Can't believe you didn't end up with him. Then she looks at Charlie. She says, ooh, he's even greater. She said, why did you choose Charlie? She said, well, when I'm out with Bill, he makes me feel like he's the most wonderful person in the whole world. The fairy godmother was like, what's wrong with that? She said, you wrote that that makes you feel like he's the most wonderful person in the world to be with. Why wouldn't you want to be with him? She says, because when I'm out with Charlie, he makes me feel like I'm the most wonderful person in the world. And that's the difference. That is the difference in romance, and that is the difference in the business world. The customer that you make feel as if they are the most important people in the world, those are the customers that you will connect with. The customers that you make feel that you're the best person in the world, those are the customers that you will not connect with. Even though you may well be an amazing, wonderful business person, it's not the problem. Because ultimately people are drawn like a magnet to those businesses and to those people that make them feel great. This is the pleasure principle. This is the doorway into the hearts and the minds of people. It works not only with business relationships, it works with children, it works between employer and employee, it works in every kind of setting. If you nurture and nourish the people around you, and you help them develop, and you make them feel important, and they will want to be with you. And that's the essence of connecting, in the case that we're talking about, with your customer. Self-interest is the key to understanding all consumer behavior. You need to understand that the pleasure principle is all about people doing that which makes them feel good, not you feel good. As Stu Leonard said, people don't come to the store to find out what they can do for me. They want to know what I can do from them. Now, the knowledge of this pleasure principle, of the fact that this button exists inside people and can be turned on and off, is a critical component, and we're going to talk about that later on. But you can understand that understanding this button is exactly what they tried to teach you when you took your marketing course, if you took one, where they discussed a target market. Because the target market has all have similar buttons. And what the companies are trying to do is find out what those buttons are. So we're going to talk about that.